When I joined the Teach for America New York City Corps in 2006, I didn't have any tattoos. I got my first ink this past June because one particular concept had been floating around my mind throughout my 6 years of teaching up until that point, which was a volume dial. The volume dial concept first occurred to me as a college senior. It was interactive, anyone could reach over and turn me down or up. It could be a metaphor for voice, it could be a critical examination. Who has a voice? Who is told to quiet down? At the time, the idea was a half joke. It was, a corporeal performance art piece that would reflect my reputation as a loud, angry dyke. Because that's what I was at the time. I was a self-identified, don't call me a lady, I hate the word lesbian, butch dyke. And that's how I entered Teach for America and began teaching at my Title I public school in Brooklyn. I was Miss K, I was tattooless, white, Yale educated, already binding my chest, and already gender non-conforming enough that on day one of my teaching career, a 12-year-old student shouted out, "Miss K, more like Mr. Gay." I commended that student on his inference-making skills. My volume dial also illustrates a spectrum. And if there's one thing a transsexual can attest to and embody, it's the existence of spectra and of human malleability along those spectra. I transitioned from Miss to Mr. over the 4 years at my placement school for Teach for America. And one of the first questions that shocked ed reformers often ask me is, how did your students and their parents handle it? But whatever my students and their families personally thought of my transition, I can tell you that it was neither a priority nor a new phenomenon to them. The ability to avoid people that we deem weird or freakish or dangerous is a distinctively privileged one. And so it actually wasn't until I joined staff at Teach for America that I felt surrounded by colleagues who didn't even have people like me on their radar. And if my fellow ed reformers couldn't see me, how could they even begin to see the struggles of a confused young person? I was a young person too. I was a child once. And at age 8, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and held my ponytail behind my head and admired how much better I'd look like as a boy. And by middle school, I'd already dissociated thoroughly enough from my body that I blocked out all cognitive recognition of puberty, but I vividly remember the social damage. I was no longer allowed on boys' teams. I was expected to develop crushes on male friends. And so I met expectations because young people are very adaptable. I dated boys and I thought that that's what romance and desire were supposed to feel like since I knew nothing else. So I shudder when I hear teachers say, there are no LGBTQ students in my classroom. The fact is there are queer kids in every single classroom regardless of age or zip code. It's this insidious, common refusal to see the potential for queer and the potential for trans in every single child that condemns children like the one I used to be to a lifelong battle with self-loathing. As teachers, we socialize children and we police their bodies on a daily basis. And with that charge comes a tremendous responsibility. Who are we refusing to see? Trans people know that before we can really tackle social justice issues that are based on identity, we have to be able to see bodies. And particularly, we need to see how meaning is mapped onto those bodies. So let's take a moment and see what meaning might be mapped onto my body right now. Just a little over 4 years ago, I began injecting myself with testosterone every other week. My body changed terrifyingly quickly, starting with my voice and my junk. At the same time, it wouldn't change quickly enough. I remember every single new hair that grew. Other changes happened a little more subtly. I can't pinpoint when my face changed shape or when my body weight shifted, but standing here, I'm physical evidence that they happened. About 3 months after I injected myself for the first time, I went back to my school for my 3rd year of teaching 12-year-olds who were undergoing an eerily similar process for the first time. That was interesting. 3 years ago, I had a double mastectomy, or what's called top surgery. My particular operation is called a keyhole, where the surgeon removes breast tissue without removing the nipple by making incisions around the areola. As a result, I have full nipple sensation, and I have no scars except for a 3 millimeter long mark under each armpit where drains were inserted underneath my skin along my ribcage and then later pulled out. This means that I'm both incredibly fortunate in the sense that I can walk around shirtless in public with no fear of detection, but it's also really strange. I have virtually no evidence that my former torso ever existed. And my body literally proves a fluidity that mainstream society refuses to acknowledge. In places like schools, we're taught how to talk about bodies. We're taught very rigid notions of what an ideal body is like, what it means to be normal, what it means to be healthy, what it means to be attractive. Trans people step outside of these lines, and the reminders of our aberration from a norm are incessant. Every single time I hear someone say, "Is your baby a boy or a girl?" as though it's the end-all be-all of childhood identity. Every single time I see children lined up in boys' lines and girls' lines. Every single time someone says, "Oh, you know how middle school girls are." It could be alienating and even infuriating to people like me. Like most trans people I know, I'm a little reluctant to acknowledge that this kind of gender generalizing hurts. And that's in part because many, even well-intentioned people, then immediately start citing data, and they start trying to explain to me how impractical it is for me to expect that my statistically rare experience be taken into account in how we operate, or how we think. So I've learned to lower my expectations of the world around me accommodating my needs, which was granted quite an awakening after growing up a middle-class white woman who was used to people prioritizing my feelings. There's really nothing like being part of a statistically insignificant population to help you understand the limitations of numbers in social justice movements. Trans people to varying degrees experience an institutionalized form of social judgment or stigma. But no matter, whatever attempts to cleanly pathologize or categorize us will inevitably fail. All of my IDs, as a factor of a lot of privileges that I have, read male. My uterus says female. My physical presence in 2013 says male, but everything before 2008 says female. Family photo albums, yearbooks, the minds of my high school boyfriends, how I was socialized. So trans people are treated like what queer theorist Donna Haraway calls cyborgs, part natural human, part artificial alien or robot-like creature. And so my volume dial challenge is, well, if I'm a cyborg, if I'm artificial, then try to control me with this dial on my wrist. At a time in my life when I could live a stealth life, it's also a really important reminder to myself of my history and how much I've learned and grown. And indeed, over the past 7 years, I've gotten a crash course in the New York City public education system, in the convoluted landscape of reform, in my own privilege, in the horrifying educational disparities that exist for LGBTQ youth in low-income communities. And it's actually been through extended investment in those communities and not through numbers that I've also developed a stronger understanding of my responsibility to queer, trans, and gender nonconforming youth. One of the ways to wield that responsibility is to share a story. So I'm turning my volume dial up right now with you all to make legible something that, even though it was never hidden, many of you might not have seen. I'm turning it up in the hopes that we all continue to push our blinders out. And I'm turning it up because you cannot understand something that you're not choosing to see.